Imagine stepping into an original D&D setting that's been lovingly written and DM'd by Tim Burton or Shel Silverstein. Instead of elves and dwarves, you have a giant card shop that's also a person, a decadent duke, and this scary-looking upside-down guy who only dreams of being able to rhyme.
I was about to say that. That's my rhyme.
Just to give a few examples, that's the wildly creative premise of Lost in Random, a wholly original action-adventure game that thinks outside of the box. Its combat wears thin, but exploring its worlds never does.
Perfect. I collect ghost stories, you know. Kind of the premier ghost story collector around here. Kind of the only one, too. So, tell me the story of this ghost.
You play as Even, one of two twin sisters, Even and Odd, who are fated to roll the Queen's mystical six-sided dice at age 12. The resulting roll determines which of the 6 worlds in the kingdom of Random they'll spend the rest of their lives in.
For random is fair, random prevails, and random rules.
Long story short, Odd is sent off to the Queen's world, but Even isn't willing to let her go without a chase. The world-spanning adventure that ensues after you manage to escape the dreary starting zone of Onecroft takes plenty of nods towards films like The Nightmare Before Christmas, Corpse Bride, Coraline, and other similarly gothic-inspired stop-motion films. Despite the entirety of Random being drenched in dark hues of black and green and gray, each world still offers completely unique and decadently layered settings. For example, Two Town's denizens feature 2 directly opposite personalities that can shift each time the Queen rolls her dice. This has resulted in the construction of a separate Two Town called Upside Down Town, which completely obscures the town's skyline, kinda like that one scene out of Inception. It makes Two Town feel that much more immense, and you can tease apart as much or as little of the zone's background story as you'd like through side quests, or by speaking to the many interesting NPCs hanging around town before moving on.
Everyone in Two Town knows about the Upside Down Town. Why, you just have to look up a little ways ahead.
Meanwhile, Freedom and its people are trapped in a perpetual state of war over a series of petty squabbles between the 3 outlandish triplets. The other, equally otherworldly characters of the world react to them in weird and unexpected ways that keep you guessing. For instance, you're constantly told about Lost in Random's appropriately named and visually terrifying Shadow Man. You hear snippets about this terrifying monster that stalks the shadows and snatches lost children who wander too far from home, but when you finally meet him, he's frustrated that the war is too distracting and no one's paying attention to him.
And so nobody fears the Shadow Man anymore?
This is just one of many ways that Random feels lived in and richly detailed. And these otherwise creepy characters are made lovable through the genius of Lost in Random's writing. Scenes like this one give rise to some genuinely cackle-worthy exchanges.
Welcome to the warrior's meditation. It's much calmer than the warrior's training. Oh, don't worry about that. Forget I mentioned it, and ignore any screaming that you hear from nearby.
In fact, moving to the next world is kind of like watching the next movie in a 20-hour series of timeless holiday classics. And then there's the semi-real-time combat, which, as you probably guessed from the name, leans heavily on dice rolls and cards. It's sort of like Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat system, but it's a bit simpler once you get used to these very random rules. You start each battle with your trusty slingshot, which allows you to shoot crystals off of the faces and bodies of your foes. Once you've collected enough of them, a new card is added to your hand, up to a total of 5 cards. The part that makes this interesting is the fact that each card in your hand is randomly pulled from your much larger deck, which lets you store up to 15 cards at a time, including duplicates if you want a few cards that show up more regularly than others. And you have no way of predicting which cards will appear when you roll your dice. Don't worry if this sounds too weird, because most of the cards you can equip in your deck include the usual mix of swords, healing, potions, and bombs. The real-time part of combat kicks in when you spawn a weapon and button mash your foes to death or until your weapon breaks. All of this cards business would shuffle Lost in Random's real-time combat around and make it more appealing than the average button masher if the enemy's AI wasn't so easy to outsmart with such minimal effort. There are 2 issues here. The first issue is that you're never prompted to select a difficulty level unless you go digging into the menus after already having spent time playing. The other issue is that on the default difficulty mode, Each foe is packed with a lot of hit points, and a single battle might take up to 20 minutes or longer simply because of how many of them will spawn before you're finished. Regardless, each of these enemy types are pretty slow and predictable, and it's easy to use any damage dealing cards to beat them down without thinking too hard. It feels great for the first few battles, especially when you're playing with interesting card combinations like Blacksmith's Blink and Crystal Curse, but the novelty does eventually wear off. Combat encounters end up appearing a bit too often, slowing down the pacing of the otherwise excellent story and dialogue sequences that make Lost in Random truly shine.
I am the queen, and my dark dice will decide your fate.
This sprawling action-adventure has way more meat on its bones than you may first expect if you're only looking for a quick dive into a Tim Burton-esque wonderland. Lost in Random is loaded with tons of side quests, interesting lore, and a decent semi-real-time, semi-turn-based combat system that ends up getting bogged down by dumb enemy AI. Beyond that, the 5 worlds that follow the drab intro each offer their own unique quirks, struggles, and characters that won't be forgotten anytime soon. For more story-rich action-adventure games, check out our reviews of The Forgotten City or The Artful Escape. And for everything else, keep it here on IGN.
There's only one way to find out. When I roll them bones!